All right, our speaker today is going to talk to us about conservation easements is Ms. Brittany Wagner of Texas A&M Natural Resources Institute. She works there as a project or program manager. During her work for NRI, Brittany builds strategies and works with partners to grow recognition for the Institute's research and products. She also assists with implementation of new projects that support NRI's fundamental goals of promoting science-based solutions for the stewardship of private lands. Brittany also is a land steward herself and practices ranch management methodologies on her Hill Country ranch. Also joining us is a very special guest, Brittany's grandfather, Mr. Howard Hicks. Mr. Hicks is a fifth-generation rancher and owner of the Pike Davis Ranch in Willow City, which was established in 1854. Brittany tells me he is also an avid historian, an Aggie from the class of '69, and an expert cedar thinner. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the controls over to Brittany.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Give me a thumbs up if you're Aggies. Okay. Thank you, Amanda. I was so excited when Amanda asked if we wanted to kind of join this conversation and join the Wild at Work series, especially talking about conservation easements. The Institute on its own does a lot of work with private landowners, and we try to bring as much clarity as possible to the idea of conservation easements and what that process looks like especially through our Texas Land Trends program. If you're not familiar with that, it is it's an exciting program. We publish a few times a year on just what's happening in Texas and really what's happening on private lands. And I guess further than that, it's an exciting, I guess, topic for me personally, because we have a conservation easement on our property. So talking about this is a personal passion, but it's also something that I very luckily get to talk about for my day job. So I was really excited to hear from Amanda that you guys are interested in this topic and you wanted to hear a little bit more about it. But it would not be very authentic of me if I did not bring along my grandfather, who was a major part and really the driver and the decision maker for our family when we decided to adopt a conservation easement on our property. And I think, at the time I was just barely coming out of high school, I think, and kind of learning a little bit more about how to independently be involved in the ranch and how, I guess, that passion was going to live on in my life and how I was going to go to college and what I was going to do, but also how I was going to stay connected to the ranch. So my perspective during that time was very distracted, obviously. But now, since we've had the conservation easement on our property for, I guess, almost 12 years or so, around 10, 12, the timeline's kind of weird for our process, but it's really kind of served as a catalyst for a lot of different ways that I've been involved in the ranch, and it's something that I'm incredibly passionate about. So now I'm going to try to share my screen. We'll see how this works. So you should see a PDF that says, what is a conservation easement? The background of this is just kind of a map screenshot of where our ranch is. We luckily are located in the Texas Hill Country, beautiful Hill Country, and it has been there my whole life. So as a young landowner up and coming, I am every day reminded how lucky we are to have the ranch. I say we're kind of in the middle of that Marble Falls, Johnson City, Fredericksburg triangle. We're off of the Althouse Davis Road. Grandpa could do a much better job of helping you understand where we are, but we're sitting at about 1,600 acres, depending on how you look at our property and how we're divided and share and partner with our cousins. We have extremely diverse landscape throughout. Thankfully, we have water resources that run through there, which, right now is kind of a tough subject to talk about. But we decided, or I guess Grandpa really kind of was the driving force in saying, starting that conversation. And I think my uncle actually saw somewhere at a convention, the Texas Land Conservancy had some information out about conservation easements. And he said, Dad, I think this is maybe something that we need to look into. And lo and behold, I think we made a decision as a family to go ahead and pursue this. And I'll talk a little bit more about why we made that choice and maybe some other reasons why you could possibly make that choice too. So I do kind of want to start with a baseline of information, because there's a lot of technical information out there about conservation easements, and sometimes it can be a little overwhelming, and especially when you get to speaking specifically about Texas, there's maybe different organizations and trusts and landholders explain the process a little differently depending on how they go about it and how they work to serve private landowners. So just so that we're all on the same page and everybody kind of has this baseline of information, usually you get to this point because you're asking, how do I make sure that this land stays the way that it looks forever? Or how do we make sure that we are doing our due diligence to make sure we know what preservation looks like as a landowner? And what options do I have out there? So a conservation easement is a legal agreement between you, the property owner, and a qualified conservation organization. Often they're referred to as a land trust, and then further on in the process, they are referred to as your holder, or a public agency. So when you enter into this kind of legal agreement, the owner voluntarily agrees to restrict the type and amount of development or certain uses that may take place on their property to protect the natural, productive, or cultural features of the land. I did want to put in, this key word is voluntary. It is, it's something that you really have to make the decision and be the driver and move this conversation forward. It is totally on the landowner to make this decision if that's something that they're interested in for their land. And then once you start that process and you essentially pick which organization you'd want to go with, there are many different conservancies and land trusts in the state of Texas that you could choose to partner with. And you could, I think in some cases, there are multiple partnerships that you could have for your property. They really carry you through this process, and they make sure that you are taken care of, that you have a clear vision of what's going on through the process. And I think without our partners at the Texas Land Conservancy and the clarity that they gave us and the reassurances that were there, and just those relationships that we were able to build with them, I don't know how this process could have been any better for us, really. And Grandpa may have some other insight on that than what I do. I don't know if you want to share anything about that beginning voluntary decision, Grandpa.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. She's right. It was her uncle, my younger son, that really started looking into this. And I think he went to one of the State Association of Land Trusts annual meetings, and that's where he met the people at Texas Land Conservancy and learned more about it. And I'd been thinking about it, but I hadn't done much looking into it. He looked into it, thought it's something we should consider. So we contacted the people there at Texas Land Conservancy and talked to them about it a little bit. And then the main thing we did though is we got the whole family together. That was, at that point, it was my children and grandchildren. We now have some great grandchildren, but they weren't around then. And sat down with them in a meeting with Mark Steinbach and one of the people there that work with him at Texas Land Conservancy, and talked through the whole process. What did it mean to tie up your land in perpetuity? And what was it that the family wanted to do? So I didn't feel like it was right for me to make this decision when my children and my grandchildren are going to have to live with it. So we talked about it. We're all really passionate about conserving land in the hill country as it is now, because there's so much fragmentation and development going on. We wanted to at least keep our land as it has been for 150 years or so. And so the family came to an agreement, and that's when we did our first conservation easement. And that was on a smaller piece of property, about 175 acres. And then we had a partnership with our cousins on the larger ranch adjacent of about 1,400 acres. And we started talking to them about it. They had the same desires. And 3 years later, we did a conservation easement with Texas Land Conservancy on that piece of property.
Mhm. So I guess the next question, after Grandpa went in and had this conversation to get some clarity, was, okay, so, this is essentially making a land deed. It's changing the way that the land is going to be seen and looked at, down to how it is filed in the courthouse. So what rights do we actually retain as the owner? And this is for both properties. He mentioned we technically have 2 conservation easements, one on a smaller piece and one on a larger piece that's more part of a family partnership. And really, we treat the ranch as one piece because it's all together. But on paper, it's 2 separate pieces, and we kind of we had some practice, I think, with that first one to figure out how this works and what that process looks like. So with the conservation easement, the landowner retains the legal title to the property and determines the types of land uses to continue and which ones you want to restrict altogether. As part of the arrangement, the landowner grants the holder, so in our case, that was Texas Land Conservancy, the right to periodically, typically annually, assess the condition of the property to ensure that it's maintained according to the terms of the legal agreement. And we'll talk a little bit more about that monitoring process later on. But I think this is kind of what Grandpa was getting to, is that in the first right out of the gate situation, you have to kind of imagine what the land is going to look like, and how, kind of help plan ahead, even down to, we definitely don't want this land to be broken up. That's kind of basic requirement. We don't want it to be, if it were ever unfortunately to be sold, we wouldn't want it to be broken up. But we definitely had to make some hard decisions on what exactly do we want the land to look like in lifetimes that we're not going to be a part of. And that's sometimes hard to comprehend. So in Grandpa's way, we all came together and we said, yes, we want to do this, and we're going to try to think as far ahead as we possibly can. And there were little details, kind of like when you build a house. When we built a house on our ranch, I think that because I was so young when we built this house, so that we could all fit somewhere, especially during the holidays when we were all up there, I don't think it ever crossed Grandpa's mind that he might need to make room because his great-grandsons will be there too, and we'll have so many more people than what you originally planned. So it's just hard to sometimes think outside of what's happening in your lifetime, what you know to be right in front of you. And even, 20 years from that point, this is in perpetuity forever. So I think that it becomes an immediate mindset shift whenever you decide to pursue a conservation easement. And it's really exciting to dream up what those things could be, but it also can feel a little bit burdensome, because you don't want to burden future generations with a decision that you made because it was right in the moment and what you felt like would be right for them. So there's a responsibility there. And thankfully, land trusts and conservation agencies have a lot of experience working with families in the long term, especially like ours. And we'll talk a little bit more about the history of our ranch coming up here in a minute. So I do want to back up a little bit again and go back to this idea of perpetuity. So this is me and my one of my eldest son and Grandpa and my husband. And just for some comic relief and some insight into our family, these are actually his pets. I know he calls them cattle, but they're very docile and he loves all of them and takes very good care of them. My husband married into all this craziness, but these are his great grandkids. And River's now a year old, who I was pregnant with at the time, but they get to be little whippersnappers out there running around. And I remember as a kid being as young as they are, just, never imagining that that land may one day not be ours or may not even be there. And that is such a reality, I think, today for landowners or people who have had to make some hard decisions based on how your family changes. And how circumstances change. And sometimes we get in these tough situations where we have to make those long-term decisions. But perpetuity it's a word that Grandpa uses a lot, and it is oftentimes sometimes incomprehensible to think this land will be there forever. How many times do you get to make a decision about something that is guaranteed to be there beyond your lifetime? And I mean, I can't think of very many other examples outside of this. So anyway, that's kind of what our family looks like now. And when we made this conservation easement, this little guy, Cash and River, were not there. Neither was James, my husband. So even in the last 10, 15 years, our family has changed. And it's just been a really beautiful way to help us focus what our purpose is for the ranch, because it's going to be there, and we have to be able to instill values and education really in our younger generations and my kids, and make sure that that's the mindset that they have from when they're little. That land is there, it is theirs, and it's something that is a priority in our family and something that we are responsible for stewarding. So, and in thinking about that, kind of got a little heavy, I feel like. Just how do you even make that decision to move forward, to pursue something that will be around beyond your lifetime in a future that you won't be a part of, is really hard. But for us, I see this quote every now and then come up, and I don't even, I think Grandpa said this before our second kiddo was born. But for him and for the generations before him and for us, the ranch represents the hard work of the men and women in his mother's family, who settled the land and kept it in the family for 165 years. And now he gets to see his grandchildren and his great grandsons develop a love for the ranch as well. And I think if I had to sum up our why and our mission, and really kind of what's at the heart of the decision to really take this heavy situation, turn into a conservation easement, and to move forward that way. I mean, we really kind of, you pave the way in a trajectory for your family. And I can think of very few other higher callings and reasons to do a conservation easement other than that, it's our responsibility to steward the land and hopefully keep it looking somewhat like it did when we settled it, and to continue to work to do things even better, and to make sure that we're constantly working to educate ourselves, working to connect with other experts, and to just maintain the land as it is, but to do our best to continue, I guess, that through the next generations and instill those values in my kiddos, really, because they're the next generation right now. I did dig up this picture just to put some things in perspective. There's my grandpa in the cat hat with his funny little grin, standing in the back. But I am the little kid sitting right in the middle. That's my uncle's whose lap I'm in. And in the black and white photo, that is my son and then my uncle's youngest son sitting there. And we were actually doing a prescribed burn. So there's nothing like bringing goldfish to a prescribed burn because you're on the sidelines and no one will let you carry the torch or do anything close to the fire. But that was a really cool experience, and probably one of the first, since some of the younger kiddos have kind of grown up and been around some of this, but it was the first, I think, event that we actually have pictures of where there's I mean, 4 generations, I think, standing around and looking at what, this practice of prescribed burn. It's such a, I think, something so memorable because it's fire and potentially dangerous, and they're little boys, and it was exciting for them. And I think that Paul and Cash are going to remember that for the rest of their lives. So that was just a cool thing to find this photo and remember I'm the one sitting in Matt's lap, and then our kiddos are here not too far away from where this photo was taken, on the same land, practicing stewardship. I guess being a part of stewardship practices like prescribed burn. And that is something that I hope 20 years from now we still continue to do. And then maybe when Cash is 40 and he decides to get married and start dating and having kids, he'll have the same conversations with them, and we can carry that on. So that's really our why we decided to pursue this, and why we still pursue it every day while we're out there. I did want to talk about, I don't know if we had any questions or if I needed to take a break for a second.
Well, Brittany, I'll tell you, I've got one question that I see somebody had. Someone has asked, so what's in it for the holder? Specifically, how does it benefit the holder financially?
That's a good question. I do have some resources that talk a little bit that I'm going to share at the end of this, that talks a little bit about the role of the holder and what they do. Most of the time they're nonprofit or they're land trusts. And they do require, I guess I'll speak for TLC specifically because that's who we work with. And I know that other land trusts are funded in different ways. But their mission is essentially to host and facilitate this opportunity and possibility of a conservation easement. With Texas Land Conservancy, we're asked for, I guess it's a gift. Grandpa, you may have to help clarify some of these. When they start their actual work, which is, after we put together the conservation easement and it goes into effect, they are who facilitates the annual monitoring. Anything else that they do for us is because they've taken on the responsibility of the conservation easement. So anytime we pick up the phone and call Mark Steinbach or Stephen or anyone else on their team, they're there to help us. And that's what our relationship is about. But we do pay for the conservation easement. Again, that's a grandpa question. But I do think that there's either an annual gift or the first gift once the easement is established. Can you shed some light on that, Grandpa?
Yeah, what it is, since they will have the responsibility, the trust will have the responsibility in perpetuity to monitor the property to make sure that the landowners are living up to the agreement, to the easement, that requires personnel and other resources. And so we gave a gift initially, and that's something you kind of negotiate with the land trust, and they put that money, they invest that money, and then that's how it's paid for in perpetuity. And sometimes in our particular piece of property, one of the conditions of the easement was it could never be subdivided. So it could be sold, but it had to be sold as a one piece of land and could never be subdivided, and very limited additional housing could be placed on it and those kind of restrictions. So sometimes people who have a conservation do sell that piece of land. So then that conservation easement continues, and the land trust has that responsibility to make sure that the new landowner understands what the easement is and lives up to that easement. And so sometimes that can get a little bit challenging, and sometimes can even incur legal fees to compel someone to do what the agreement says. So that's why there's a need for funding up front.
I hope that helps answer that question. I think there's a little bit more of the technical side of that in these two resources that I'll share here at the end, but that's a really good question and a fair question. And thank you, Joe, for your comment. We are very fortunate to have a family with a constructive relationship. We're still people, and we still have just very bluntly, we have a lot of different dynamics that go along with our family. I think that we are most fortunate because of grandpa's generation and that foundation that they built and instilled in the younger generations to care for and to love the ranch like we do. I think had this, my dad would die if I said this to him, but had this been something that we started with his generation, it wouldn't have been able to be, I think, a priority for him. And I think oftentimes that happens, and it would have been really easy for me, and I guess that my siblings and our generation it still is very easy for us to go a different direction and to invest time and energy into other things like career, family, and it becomes very easy to put the ranch on the back burner because we don't live there. We have homes elsewhere, so I think it's an active everyday connection point, and I think you definitely have to work for it and with it and make decisions together. And they're not sometimes, especially with stewardship and resources that are limited, it becomes complicated sometimes, and we have to have those hard conversations. But I think we've gotten good at having those hard conversations and not avoiding them when we need to. So I do think we're very fortunate. I do think that definitely started, and that foundation started with grandpa's generation for sure. Thank you, Clay, for clarifying. He said as nonprofits, it also helps to meet their mission as land trusts. And that is their mission. Y'all are taking on the responsibility for taking care of us crazy people. So I did kind of want to dive in a little bit to other reasons. Sorry, does the trust protect it from eminent domain? This is a really hard question to answer off the top of my head. We do have resources though that talk about this. I do want to say that yes, there are some protections in place. Eminent domain, especially recently with the Texas Supreme Court, has been really hard to kind of navigate. So Cheryl, I don't know if you would like to talk about this maybe offline, because there's a lot of confusing literature involved, but it's a really good question and something that we have talked about as a family too. Okay, I'm going to get out of this chat before I just continue these little conversations. So aside from preserving heritage, which you guys have all kind of heard about our ranch, we've now 168 years of family history tied to our land, and continuing that legacy of stewardship is, again, that's our purpose and our compass for how we make decisions on the ranch, when there are a lot of different directions that you could take land when you have it. The second one, I would say, there's Steve Nelly said this one time in I can't remember what presentation he was giving. He talked about this ecological conviction. And I think that there's a responsibility for the land that we have. And when you own that private land, some people, it's enough of a reason to know that the potential of fragmentation, the potential of that land breaking up is really high. And I did want to kind of hop over to, I think I put it in here. This is a screenshot from a Texas Land Trends publication that NRI put out. And it has this land conversion process. And in the research that we've done with the trends happening among private landowners, this is usually the formula that ends up happening. There's economic growth, then that leads to population growth and increased demand for rural land, then high land values and lots of incentives to subdivide or sell that land, which then leads to land fragmentation and conversion for other uses like development. That is a really powerful equation that happens over and over and over again. And if you have time to read some of the Texas Land Trends publications, they are really enlightening and letting us know, I mean, really, there's only about 245,000 private landowners who own more than 95% of the land in Texas. And when you think about the responsibility of those private landowners to make sure that open space remains open and that working lands remain healthy and intact, that's a heavy responsibility. But there are options like conservation easements that help to make sure that no matter who owns the land, whether the land gets sold or not, it's still under a conservation easement. And I don't know that it's even, I think that there are very, very rare cases where that easement could be bought or maybe changed or altered, but for on the face of it, a conservation easement is permanent. And that's how it's treated. It's how it's seen by the state and how it's seen by land trusts. So this is definitely, private landowners play a critical role in preserving our open spaces and working lands. And there's the benefits and what we call ecosystem services, like clean air and clean water and land for ag that are supplied by private landowners, is becoming more and more vital, especially, right now, our drought is top of mind for a lot of people in Texas. And when you look at the value of water conservation on private lands, which is actually becoming a practice to put a real value on it, I mean, to me, it's priceless. Like you can't get the water conservation effects when you develop that land and you lose hundreds of thousands of gallons of water just by taking up even the smaller ranches that are around urban areas. We just can't afford that. So I think that's a second reason, especially in the last, from that 2012 to 2018 timeframe, when most of the conservation easements in Texas were taken up. That was a big catalyst, I guess, or priority for those landowners. The third are obviously tax benefits and estate planning. When a conservation easement is donated, the gift may be recognized as a charitable contribution, which can reduce the landowner's taxable income. Conservation easements can also be a useful estate planning tool to reduce estate tax liability and allow ranches to remain in the family. Again, going back to that, this little equation here, it becomes really easy for a family to have to make the decision to sell or subdivide because of these incentives that are there, especially with the burden of estate taxes when they're planning. The next thing I wanted to do with you guys is just kind of walk you through our process. This is specifically with the Texas Land Conservancy so that you can kind of get an idea of what the cadence of events is. I'm going to hop into the chat real quick to see if there's anything that I can answer for you guys.
So I'll note, just keeping an eye on the chat. It looked like Clay Thompson had a response, I think, related to the eminent domain question. He had said the eligible entity must pass the endowment and monitoring responsibility to another eligible entity that is spelled out in the conservation easement. Also a note on that question, if there are other resources, Brittany, that you can think of that you'd like to provide to folks, we can follow up with our attendees afterwards and provide some good links and stuff.
Yeah, I'll have some links to show you guys on the screen, but we'll definitely follow up with some really great resources for you.
Other questions? If the holder dissolves, does the trust have to be reestablished? Which
I think that is that maybe what Clay was answering?
That, yeah, so maybe that was related to that other question. Joe also has two questions. First is, how do you find a land trust? First of all, and what is the typical endowment the landowner gives the land trust? So
one of the resources that I'm going to give you has a list of different land trusts, but there's not really from our experience, there's not really a one and done kind of deal. I think you can have many different site visits and conversations with different land trusts in Texas. One of the resources was actually written in partnership with the Texas Ag Land Trust, which is a partner that NRI works with quite often. And it really, I think the other factor to consider is where you are, where your property is. Our property is in Edwards Plateau, Texas Hill Country, so it made sense to work with TLC, which is, I guess they're more like in the Spicewood, Austin area. So it's convenient for them when they have to do their annual monitoring. I don't know how much of a factor that plays in, once you actually pick the trust that you want to go with, but there are several that you can choose from and interview with and have conversations with and take your time, because it's a huge decision to make for your family, and you want to make sure that you have a long-term partner who you really want to invest in time with. Okay, and then I think there was a second question, sorry. And what is the typical endowment the landowner gives the land trust? Grandpa, do you want to answer that one?
Can you repeat it? I'm sorry.
Yeah. What is the typical endowment the landowner gives the land trust? Is there an answer for typical?
I'm trying to remember. It's been 12 to 14 years. It was, I don't remember, it seemed like it was maybe more than $10,000, but it's based on the size of the piece of property. So, how big a responsibility it is for the land trust to monitor that particular piece of property.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the other things you mentioned in the previous slide is that normally this is considered a charitable contribution by the IRS. And so depending on what the federal legislation is at that particular time, you can deduct a certain, well, let me back up a little bit. When you do a conservation easement, there's a reduction in the value of the land because you limit what it can be used for. So one of the expenses in doing a conservation easement is you have to have an appraisal done that determines the value of the land after the conservation easement or when the conservation easement has taken place. And so that reduction in value can be spread out over a certain number of years. It depends on what I think it was 15 years on ours. That was what the federal law was at that time for that contribution. And you can apply that against your adjusted gross income every year. So it can reduce taxes. So it saved us more money than what the initial cost was of the appraisal, the legal cost, the contribution, all of those things. You'll get paid back over a certain period of time, but it's going to take a while. I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact way they determined how much the contribution is. And it depends on the land trust. And also sometimes you can get some help from state agencies or the federal government on that kind of funding if you happen to qualify.
Mm-hmm. We'll go in a little bit more detail into the process that Grandpa's talking about as far as the appraisal is concerned, and how that amount is calculated, because that's part of the process, is making those decisions and acquiring that information. One of the other, they're on the, I can show you guys on the Texas Land Conservancy website, they do describe the factors that are involved in deciding the, I guess, the investment or like the endowment, which are things like the size of the land, the distance from their office, that kind of thing, for traveling, and then the annual monitoring. So my dates here from, I think this was 2008, 2009. We did start having those preliminary discussions about our history and goals. They're not really preliminary. We've always known our history is there, but definitely having those conversations with the full family, and starting to make, I guess, progress towards a conservation easement. So again, this is in particular for Texas Land Conservancy. We had an initial site visit with them. So they do an initial evaluation of the property in person. So this is going back to what I was saying about choosing who you want to have a partnership with. They're on your property, then a couple of other times, and then they're there for you once a year for monitoring, and you want to make sure that you have a good relationship with them because it's going to be long-term. TLC and most other trusts will have to go through a board approval. So as nonprofit organizations or a trust, most are governed by the board, who will also approve of their new projects. And then we brought in the legal advice that Grandpa referred to. So we worked with an independent attorney and a financial advisor to learn about the tax implications and how the classification of our ranch was going to change, what that would change for us financially. Most of the time your trust or your holder is, they are not going to provide the legal or the financial advice for you. You'll want to work with somebody independent. And then we moved into the drafting phase. So this is, like I say here, the heart of the project, where we set the plans that will remain attached to the land in perpetuity. I think we probably leaned on TLC, leaned on some other organizations and other advice to make sure that we were making a very comprehensive decision correctly. I mean, that's drafting it, I think, is probably one of the hardest parts about this, because you have to think about the parameters that you're putting on the property and knowing that they're probably not going to change from what you put in the document that day. And then you'll go into your appraisal. So once the easement is drafted, sorry, my little chat box is there. Once the easement is drafted and acceptable, the value of the land is kind of basically assessed. So you get to know the difference between the value of your land from before the conservation easement and then after the conservation easement is put into play. And that's kind of what Grandpa was referring to earlier. Then you have your baseline documentation. I have this up that I can show you guys what this looks like. So it documents the condition and the ecological variables that are present on the property, and it defines what you're working to protect in the easement. And that also goes into making sure that you know, as we monitor every year, making sure that you're upholding the conditions of the ranch and that you are abiding by what is set forth in the easement. We executed, I guess, one of our easements in 2010, signed, notarized, and recorded at the courthouse. So once a year, we spend time at the ranch with the stewardship staff of TLC to ensure the easement provisions are being followed. So that was kind of our big process. But I did want to show you guys, this is our, let me zoom out here. This is a baseline documentation report. This is for the Pike Davis Ranch, Gillespie and Vico County, and you can see it's prepared in December of 2010 by the Texas Land Conservancy. So some of the things that are in here, it is a very in-depth review of the size of the area, the location, description, structures. So they take note of what already exists. Topography, geology, the soils, the flora and fauna. This is actually a really great reference guide for us even today, to know what's out there and to kind of use for Plan ID. Lots and lots of photos and documentation go into this 36-page document for our ranch. But this is essentially what it looks like to give you guys an idea. Go back to our. Okay.
Brittany, can you go back to the legal?
Yes. Wait,
Just
you mean
back one slide from this one. Yeah, just mentioning it's working with an independent attorney. The land trust can probably suggest some people, but you do want to have an independent attorney doing this for you to make sure that you're protected. And it needs to be somebody that's well qualified and experienced in doing these. And so that was helpful. And also our CPA that takes care of our financial things for the ranch, income tax returns, that sort of thing, was experienced and could advise us as well. So that was important. On the drafting, that does take quite a bit of time, but the Land Conservancy will kind of give you a list of things that you need to think about. And so you need to evaluate what I want to do about all of these different variables. That's going to be something you're going to be held to for perpetuity. So that was a lot of work to working with the land trust to develop what was actually going to be in the document, in the easement.
Mhm. Okay, let's see. No, that's a lot of information, and I do want to, in a second, if we have time, I'll take you to some of the things that they describe, TLC describes on their website. And you can also go there just to kind of get an insider view of really what's probably accurate across the board for, a basic understanding of the process and how your tax situation changes once you have a conservation easement and the value of the land changes. I did want to talk about quickly how the conservation easement I mentioned has served as sort of a catalyst for us and our way of thinking about our land. And to me, maybe, there's a lot of technical information out there, and I'm hoping that the value of this conversation is that, now, feel free to pick up the phone and give me a call. We've done this. We had a conservation easement put on the property. We went through it twice. And now we've got some years between when we established it, and we've kind of, I think we've sort of, it's allowed us, I guess, to evolve our way of thinking and how we approach land stewardship, knowing that it'll be there in perpetuity. So the conservation easement really served as a catalyst for me, especially personally, seeing that investment from my grandparents and the generations before me, knowing that, well, this responsibility is on us. And we have, over the last 3 years now, have been able to invite some specialists up there to help us wrap our mind around some efficiencies for our cattle operation, for our wildlife, and how we manage the hunters that are on our property. So it's just kind of opened up this way of thinking that, it really allowed me, I guess, to invest energy and, I don't know, find ways to find opportunities that we could have people, out there and ask and really kind of lean on experts to make sure we're doing this right. And, it kind of just opened my eyes to this. We're very fortunate to own land first. And, I don't have a whole lot of other people in my life that own land and are responsible for stewarding it like we are. And this conservation easement, you put this document and you kind of change this for your land, and then all of a sudden it kind of organically helped us start looking at different ways to become stewards for the land. And I think that is there's a nuance involved there. And I don't think that you get that from looking at a website or from even knowing about what a conservation easement is, but it's definitely something that changed. I guess there was a shift in mindset for us after we established this. And I think that it helps kind of going back to earlier conversations about having lots of people from different generations with lots of different lives involved. Again, we're fairly dynamic, and we found a way to work together because this is our common ground, and we know that it's going to be there and it's our responsibility. So if we disagree on everything else, this is something that we can come together on because we know what our responsibility is. So 2 resources. The first one is this conservation easement guidebook, and I'll show you the link, and then I think Amanda from TWA can follow up with this link. This guidebook was created in 2018, and there are 15 ranches, including the Pike Davis Ranch, listed and their situations and what they did to go about adopting a conservation easement, and kind of gives you a little bit of background about where they are, who they are, how their family is made up, and what their process was. And I think it's incredibly insightful. It also has a lot of technical information that will help, I think, clarify some of the questions that were asked here financially, and when dealing with taxes and talking about the role of your holder. The second resource is a Texas Land Trends publication, different from the one that I showed earlier, but it's called Conservation Easements in Texas. This one is enlightening, I think, from a numbers standpoint. It is data and research. It does look a lot nicer than spreadsheets, thankfully. So I just think it's insightful. So it's not very long either. Neither of them are very long. And I think that they're both available online. And I think both TALT and NRI, we have hard copies of these if you're more of a hard copy reader. So feel free to reach out if you want to pick up some of these and just have around when you have time to really invest in learning. It's a process, but I think the basics of the process are pretty much the same across the board, no matter who you go with. Your relationship and the nuance of the families and how you're made up and what you really want to do and how you see the future of your land together. Those are the variables I think that change the most, regardless of who you decide to go through or choose to be your landholder. Sorry, it's the wrong way. These are the links to those if you guys want them. And that's pretty much the end of the slides that I have here. If we want to go into a kind of an open room discussion or any last minute questions from anyone.
If anybody has any last minute questions, go ahead and type those in the chat for us. We're happy to get those answered.
I'm going to zoom in on this. Another website that I did have up, the Texas Land Conservancy website to show you guys, but I think that's something it's a really easy website to navigate if you want to pop over there, and they have kind of a breakdown of the process. And specifically, I remember reading the decisions that go into deciding the size of the endowment. So I think is another really important question. I don't think that there's a minimum amount of land.
That's going to be up to the land trust, and it may depend. If it gets down really small, it may depend upon how sensitive that piece of land is and what's special about it. And sometimes that's a factor when you get down to a really small piece of property.
Thank you, Dale.
I'd add one other thing, Brittany. We had a neighbor up at the ranch who had already done a conservation easement with TLC. And so it was helpful in talking to him about his experience. And so I think that's what I would suggest, is that if you're considering a conservation easement and you choose a land trust, is ask them for some people that you can talk to that maybe have a similar situation to you, and get their feedback on how it worked and what's good about it. And if you look back on it, is there anything you would have done differently?
I don't think that the land has to be actively worked. And I guess it depends on what your definition of that is. Ours is because that's how we pay for the ranch, and that it's always been operated as a cattle ranch. If you have land that is just sitting there and it's more for recreation, and which ours is too, a lot of the time, or just to have a meeting place, I think that's fine. Again, that's just, to me, any land that we can save from being broken up or fragmented or developed on, to me, going back to ecosystem services, that land, even if it's not actively worked, is still providing water conservation value, clean air, clean water, again, wildlife habitat, any open space land, I think is valuable as it is, if we can. And that's that's for me personally. Hopefully most people agree with that. So I think that, you know, if it's something that you're really interested in pursuing, it's a great conversation to have with a land trust, and just walk them through why that's important to you to keep it saved.